nothing but the truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges from it. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has a way with words. Recently, at a public meeting, he talked of what he called the revdi culture and linked it to the freebies that political parties give during elections and then want to fulfill them after that.
ये रेवड़ी कल्चर देश के विकास के लिए बहुत घातक है। रेवड़ी कल्चर वाले कभी आपके लिए नए एक्सप्रेसवे नहीं बनाएंगे, नए एयरपोर्ट या डिफेंस कॉरिडोर नहीं बनवाएंगे।
Now, for those in the north, revdi is very familiar. It is a sesame-coated sweet that is given free during festivals. In the south, it's not very popular. But when Prime Minister Modi spoke, he spoke at a meeting in Uttar Pradesh where he was inaugurating a major expressway. And he said, people who indulge in revdi culture do not build expressways, they do not build railways, they do not build public infrastructure. Instead, what they do is wasteful, and that the country should end this revdi culture, this culture of giving out freebies. Now, Mr. Modi never says anything without a sense of timing. And political observers felt that he was directing the criticism towards Arvind Kejriwal, who is the national convener of the Aam Aadmi Party and, of course, the Delhi Chief Minister. Now, the Aam Aadmi Party, or the AAP, is now trying to contest seats in Gujarat, the bastion of Narendra Modi and the BJP, when the elections are held in December. And as part of the process of wooing voters, Kejriwal is adopting tactics and programs that he used to win Delhi and subsequently win Punjab recently with a landslide. And apart from the various other things that he's talking about to revamp Gujarat, promised the voters there that if they are elected or the AAP party is elected to power, he would ensure that the people would get 300 units of power free, electricity units. He would give rupees 1,000 as a stipend to women above 18 years of age, and went on to say that he would provide jobs to the youth until they didn't get the job. He would give out a monthly dole of rupees 3,000. Kejriwal felt that the Prime Minister, when he talked of revdi culture, was directly attacking him, so he went on the offensive as well. He said, I'm wondering whether the centre is losing out on finances after funding a lot of the health, education and other welfare measures, and this is why they're going on it. And then he went on to add, what is wrong if we give people their rightful money rather than businessmen taking them to Swiss banks? And this was a direct attack on the Modi government for not only the welfare measures that the Modi government was doing and questioning it whether they were welfare or was it freebies, but also the fact that there is a perception that the government supports big business. It was a clever attack by Kejriwal and the government immediately went on the defensive. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman came out with a statement saying that they do not object to providing health and education and other facilities to people. They see it as a welfare measure. And she went on to say what the real problem is, that if electoral parties began to promise things like television sets, laptops, gold, jewelry, other forms of inducement, these were not something that would breed efficiency in the markets or in the economy and would result in states going into debt. Now, freebies are nothing new. In fact, they have been right there from the time elections have been held in India. Tamil Nadu, in some senses, was the pioneer of that. And when I was a young reporter covering the South, I recall writing against the midday meal scheme that the then Chief Minister, M.G. Ramachandran, had introduced. Now, MGR, as he was known, was a very famous film star and he had turned politician. And the sense was that he was distributing doles in order to get votes. But that particular scheme changed the face of Tamil Nadu in an unusual way. Because when they started feeding children, the survival rates of children, the nutrition levels of children began to improve considerably, and cleverly, they also brought in pregnant mothers and others and fed them in that, apart from giving them medicines required for their health at that particular point. That saw survival of mothers and children grow enormously, and with it, because people felt confident that they would live, they had less number of children or babies, and that brought down the birth rate in Tamil Nadu. So normally you would expect birth rates to fall when education levels go up and prosperity goes up, but here, just by one particular scheme, you saw a dramatic drop in terms of the population growth rate in Tamil Nadu, which almost went down to zero growth rate, which the neighboring Kerala has, and Kerala had huge advantage of education. So it is one way of showing that what is one person's freebie could be the other person's lifeline. So successive governments across the country, both the center and the states, have introduced welfare measures that bordered on the freebie business as well. And in fact, when the UPA government came, which was headed by Dr. Manmohan Singh, he had 2 terms from 2004 to 2014, they changed some of the parameters. Rather than treat it as welfare measures, they made it a right. So everybody had a right to education, a right to health, among other things, which meant that this was no more treated as a dole, that free education would be provided up to a certain standard or an age, and also health facilities would be given. This began to change the game, and when the Modi government came to power in 2014, Prime Minister Modi also added a whole slew of welfare measures, whether, as we saw, was building of toilets, of houses, of bringing water or tap water to homes, and apart from giving, when during COVID period, giving even cash doles that were there to farmers and those who were indigent, and also, in some senses, waiving off loans. Now, the COVID period was very unusual, but even before that, Prime Minister Modi had began to be known as the Messiah of the poor by the kind of welfare schemes that were there, and the subsidy bill of the government shot up. And this, therefore, the opposition leaders are saying is that while he criticizes revdi culture in state governments, how is that he is not looking at his own backyard? The trigger really, apart from the upcoming state elections in Gujarat and in Himachal Pradesh, for Prime Minister Modi to make the statement about revdi culture was really an RBI report, a bulletin that was brought out in June 2022. Now, in this bulletin, the RBI examined the critical financial situation in various states. And they pointed out that at least 5 states were on what they called the financial cliff at the end, where they were about to topple because of their indebtedness. And these 5 states were identified as Bihar, Punjab, Kerala, West Bengal, and Rajasthan. Now, in these states, what is called the debt to GSDP ratio had crossed the danger mark of 30%. Ideally, the debt to GSDP ratio, which the government and statutory bodies have worked out for states, should be around 20%. 30% was on the dangerous side. One of these states, Punjab, had in fact breached it considerably. And the warning from the RBI was that not only these states, but there were at least half a dozen other states that were heading towards that direction. Now, why is this such a critical thing when you look at what is the debt to GSDP ratio? In states, we call it GSDP. In the center, we call it GDP or gross domestic product. In state, it's called gross state domestic product. If your debt begins to rise, what happens is that just as you take a private loan, and supposing you are unable to pay it, you take another loan to pay that loan, you're mounting your debts. And this is what is happening to a lot of the states. They are so highly indebted that they're not even able to service their current debts. So they borrow more to service these debts, and in doing so, their sustainability, particularly their financial sustainability, becomes very serious. Now, the RBI in its report also defined or gave a rough definition of what is a welfare scheme and a freebie, but they called it merit goods and non-merit goods. So under the merit goods, they talked of the employment guarantee scheme, public distribution scheme, that brought economic benefit. I'm just mentioning a few that brought economic benefit even as the money was doled out. But on the non-merit side, they talked of free electricity, free water, free bus passes, and other things, consumer goods, that really didn't enable economic growth and was a huge outgo for the states and was meant only to win votes. Now, while the RBI has come out with its own definition, political parties, depending on where they belong to, have come out with their own definitions of what they perceive to be welfare versus freebies. Now, when I spoke to Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who's the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh recently, and he said what they're really against is that during the voting process, during the election process, parties promising television sets, laptops, and other things to woo voters. He was not against welfare schemes and he felt that was important. Whereas Congress chief ministers, and particularly we had India Today magazine had spoken to Ashok Gehlot, who's the chief minister of Rajasthan, said these schemes were important and do not treat them like you treat them as beggars. We also spoke to Amit Mitra, the West Bengal former finance minister, and he said that, look, if you looked at other countries, developed countries, whether it's the US, whether it's the France, they also provide free transport to many people. They also provide free, many things that come free in that country, and they do it, though they have plenty of money, because they want to encourage demand and create economic growth. So freebies per se is even followed by developed countries, and there is no reason why India, which actually, if you take, he says that the overall percentage that of subsidies that the Indian states spend as compared to the US is far, far lower. There's no reason where in a poor country, when you give out goods like these, that these do not generate growth. And in fact, he says it stimulates demand and ensures faster growth, apart from creating what they, equal conditions and building up inclusion. Dr. Amit Mitra also mentioned that whatever Mr. Modi talked about in terms of the revdi culture, the central government, in fact, had a whole lot of welfare measures, as we had mentioned earlier. And during COVID, breached the fiscal deficit promise that it had made. There is a fiscal deficit target that was to be achieved, and the ideal is 3% of the GDP. Before COVID, it was around 4%, but after COVID struck, the Modi government, because of the various schemes it gave to ensure that people were not pushed into poverty, costed the government enormously, and the fiscal deficit went right up to 9.5%. And now they're currently trying to bring it down to 6%. What this means is that there is, when you begin to spend that kind of money and you create deficits in your budget, the danger of inflation arises and the fact that the economies can begin to spin out of your control. So while the center has to be careful about its finances, so also do states. The problem is what is called the debt trap that happens. Now, when they looked at the fact that the amount of subsidies that were being given by states and the expenses that were there, these were breaching levels that were making them, as I'd mentioned earlier, unsustainable. And that has been pushed even further or deeper into trouble because of the kind of power bills. Now, free electricity and subsidized electricity has been practiced by many states across the country, and as a result, discoms or distribution companies of power are in deep debt. And the government has repeatedly, the central government has repeatedly tried to bail them out, spending lakhs and lakhs of crores. But this is one area where a lot of the subsidies reside and is very difficult to sort out because political parties cannot withdraw these without consequences to their electoral prospects. So what happens is that the subsidies itself total now close to 12% of revenue receipts. And because salaries and pensions and everything else come out, the states have very little money. This could go up to almost 90% of the expenses, have very little money for what is called capital expenditure. So what a state is doing is that they're just able to maintain the same level but not able to provide money for expansion and other forms of infrastructure that will foster speedier growth. So the average capex expenditure that the RBI points out in many of these troubled states is barely 3 to 4% or 5% when it should be at least close to 15 to 20% of the budget. Now, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And so what does one do when we look at welfare versus freebies? People have come out with various solutions, and some of them are unpalatable for the states, but it is important that it is done. And why is that so? Because the worry now is that one of the reasons why the RBI studied this is because they didn't want India to go the Sri Lanka way. We know what happened recently in Sri Lanka. The financial mismanagement and the overall debt that they faced pushed the country to bankruptcy. Now, the concern is, and that's what the RBI studied, is that could the states turn out to be mini Lankas in the way because of their profligate spending, particularly on freebies? The conclusion is that there is always the central government to back them. They can extend loans to these states and bail them out. But the danger in doing that is that you create this financial crisis that's there that not only impacts the particular state's growth, but also the national growth. And that is something that experts say needs to be avoided. So even as we try and work out or make sense of this welfare versus freebie debate, clearly there is a need to put restrictions on that so that it doesn't get out of hand. Experts say that there are several measures that the center and the state could take to cut down on profligate behavior and on freebies. One of them is what the center has done, the Modi government has done, which is to reduce the expenses on its subsidies. This particular year and last year too, it has substantially reduced it by as much as 26%. The earlier budget, which was around rupees 4.33 lakh crores, they brought that down significantly to below 3.5 lakh crores. That is a good model to follow. Then, experts say and economists say that the center has the power to put in statutory constraints against the state for overspending. They should exercise that right and bring out laws or legislature that will do that. If the states breach it, they will not get further loans or other kinds of punitive action that comes into play. The third aspect itself is to study, and this is what top economists say, that never spend beyond your budget. So the way to check whether it is a freebie is that are you spending more? The cost of that freebie is much higher than the value it will bring to you in terms of the economy and growth. Of course, it is a very difficult measure to be there, but people say that the important thing is not only apart from statutory constraints, you need to have checks and balances, institutional checks, maybe a CAJ or Comptroller and Accountant General's audit of the matter, and very stringent monitoring of each of the welfare measures and freebies to ensure that they are not crossing the line and becoming, while they might help votes, becoming a detriment to states' progress. Of course, this is a very difficult debate. It's a great debate that is raging across the country. There are two sides to it, particularly in a poor country where welfare measures are seen as necessary, and therefore there is no agreement. Even the Supreme Court is finding it difficult. It is hearing a case to look at this problem and to see if it could form a committee, but there are pros and cons of that debate. It is for all of us to come out with sound solutions, because while it's very important that we provide welfare to our masses, particularly the poor people, it is also important that we don't exceed the limits and put us all into a financial trouble and fall off the financial cliff. So, thank you for listening to this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me the next time. Nothing but the truth.